You have tuned into The Voice of Medicine, the medical podcast filled with remarkable stories, first-hand experience, important research, and valuable life lessons. Open your mind, relax, and enjoy. Hello everybody, I hope you had a great week. My today's guest is someone very special. I want you to welcome Dr. Virginia Wotring. Virginia is an associate professor at the Baylor College of Medicine, and since years she was working very closely with NASA and with their human research program. She worked at the Center of Space Medicine and in the Department of Pharmacology, which gives her a unique expertise on the topic of spaceflight and drug use in the environment of space. Very unusual topic indeed that we're going to discuss today. Personally, I have never heard of space medicine before till I found out about Virginia's work, and I'm very excited. Let's see what she's got in store for us.
I'm delighted to be here.
Virginia, the first thing which I want to start with to give our audience a little bit, a background of yours so they know who am I actually talking to is, can you describe your path to space medicine? Because you started with the bachelor degree of chemistry, I think. So how does one go from that to space and working with NASA?
So it might not be obvious, right?
Doesn't seem like it.
For me, it was unplanned. So I got a bachelor's degree in chemistry and biochemistry. And I was particularly interested in the biochemistry part of it. After I got that degree, I worked for a few years as a technician in a biology lab that was studying some neurochemistry questions about axonal regeneration after damage. And during the course of that work, I realized just how excited I was about biology, about applying my knowledge of chemistry to biological sorts of questions. And at the same time, I met a professor in the department who studied ion channels. And I had not known about ion channels before, but from chit-chatting with him over lunch and learning about what he did, I was amazed. So I went to graduate school to study ion channels. And I spent 5.5 years learning about ligand-gated ion channels and studying the endogenous and exogenous chemicals that can affect how well they open, how fast they open, how long they stay open, or how they get blocked. So I became an expert in that, and through that work, I got more into molecular biology as well, because different subunits of ion channels can have very different functional activities, which made me want to be able to mutate a channel to see which amino acids in a channel really controlled the function of it, which is what I went on to do in my postdoctoral fellowship. So I studied structure-function relationships in ligand-gated ion channels through my postdoc. From that point of view, it looked like my path was getting very, 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 very narrow down to single ion channels, single amino acids in ion channels. Then when I went to apply for my first assistant professor job, I saw an advertisement in the back of Science. This was before all of the ads were online. So I had to actually look in the paper version of Science. And NASA Johnson Space Center was looking for a pharmacologist. That just didn't compute, and I didn't pay attention to it the first time I saw it. But they ran that ad for several weeks, so I kept seeing it again and again. So I Googled Johnson Space Center and tried to figure out why they would employ a pharmacologist. And I discovered that at Johnson Space Center, they have a very small division of space life sciences. They have a very small pharmacology research lab there. And that sounded just too intriguing to not apply. So I applied and I got the position. Then I was faced with a whole new world, taking everything I'd ever learned about how drugs interact with the molecules in our systems and putting it in a different environment. So the spaceflight environment changes a lot of aspects of our physiology. I mean, it doesn't make us unrecognizable. We still function as human beings, but it makes small changes in a lot of aspects. And we don't yet know how the drugs or the medications we might take interact with that slightly altered physiology.
Very interesting way how to get to space medicine. So how does exactly, if we want to go to the topic of physiology changing in the different environments or in the environment of space, How does the human physiology change it?
Yeah, so this is really interesting, and it's been studied by NASA and other researchers they brought in for as long as people have been going to space.
Mm-hmm.
So we have 50 years of work in this area, and we still don't know all of the answers. Very quickly after sending people to space, it was noticed that there was the potential for changes in body weight and heart rate, and that those were a little, I won't say alarming, but attention-getting at the time, because they could have serious consequences, right? Those changes were noticed not by researchers, but by the flight surgeons who were charged with taking care of astronaut health. This was back in the Project Mercury days in the 60s. And I've recently had the good fortune to work with one of those flight surgeons who has wanted to make an effort to get some publications out of his work from those early days. Mm-hmm. He was always charged with taking care of his patients and never had time to put his results into the medical literature. So I've been working with him on this lately. Bill Carpentier is his name. And we've put out one paper now on the Mercury astronauts. We're working now in the Gemini data that he has. So that was just a little segue. So they noticed initially some physiological changes. And as instrumentation improved, the ability to measure more and more things during a mission improved. So at first, there were very, very few things they could measure in a flight. They could measure someone's weight before a flight and afterwards, but couldn't do anything during. And similarly for blood pressure, body temperature even, and certainly for more advanced measures, just pre-post. As instrumentation improved, more and more things could be measured during the mission, and that helps a lot. Now we have measures of many aspects of physiology during every mission. And as time has gone by, we were able to notice that people lost bone mineral density during flights, especially longer flights. People lost muscle strength and volume. Both could have serious consequences upon returning to Earth or upon landing on any body that has any gravity, not just Earth. It would be just as bad landing on Mars as on Earth. So those came out initially. There were astronaut reports, kind of anecdotal reports about quite a number of different things that researchers are now trying to study more. In the early days, some astronauts reported when they closed their eyes to go to sleep at night, they could see flashes. They'd see like a bright flash go across the visual field. Well, we think that is radiation, and there's a lot of dosimetry that happens on spaceflight missions now to measure the species of radiation exposure as well as the amount. And there are many researchers, there's a big research effort trying to figure out what the consequences are for a human body exposed to that kind of radiation. It's low level, but it's more than we get on Earth, and it's largely galactic cosmic radiation. Sorry, I said that backwards. A little bit of heavy ion exposure, more than we get on Earth, but on the ISS right now, exposure is really very low. It will increase a lot. It increases a lot if you go beyond the Van Allen belts. So for exploration in the future, it will become significant.
Okay, so we definitely have exposure to higher doses of radiation as number one danger for the astronauts. You mentioned decreased density in bones, right? Is that and also loss of muscle? And is this because they are simply not moving or exercising the way that we do? I mean, down here on Earth, people walk, people can cycle, they can go to gym. I doubt that you can do that in a spaceship regarding of the very small space and the possibilities.
So my astronaut friends would tell you that they are just as active up there.
Okay.
It's just that it's different. There's no gravity pulling down. There's no gravity to work against. So you and I, even though we're sitting in chairs right now, our bodies are having to do a little bit of work to keep us sitting upright, not just slumping in a puddle affected by gravity. So we're working against gravity even though we're not moving. In space, that work goes to almost zero. But they locomote around their craft just as much as we move around our homes and offices during the day. They're not walking on their feet. They're moving with their arms. They're grabbing handrails. So they're performing more upper body activity rather than lower body activity. And they don't have that baseline working against gravity. Now, it was assumed from the very start, I think, that this was the only driving force in reduction of bone mineral density and muscle volume and strength. So NASA instituted a series of studies to investigate how much exercise and what kind of exercise could be done in space to help maintain bone mineral density and muscle size and strength. And now the astronauts are on exercise regimens where they actually return from flight with essentially no loss in bone mineral density or muscle size and strength. They are slotted periods of time every day to perform exercise, and they get some choices about what kind of things they can do. There's equipment on the ISS to do cycling, or there's a treadmill, and there is a machine called the Advanced Resistive Exercise Device that is built to simulate performing various weightlifting maneuvers, so they can really load a muscle very, very well and get resistive exercise. That equipment is big and bulky. Some modifications will be needed for an exploration flight, but on the ISS, it's really working great. Now, at the same time, basic research has continued along these lines, and recent results, I wish I could remember a citation for you, but there's a recent paper that shows some gene expression changes in muscle cells that indicate it may not be just the unloading. There may actually be a radiation component to this as well.
Okay.
Yeah, so it could be that metabolism in the muscles and possibly bones is affected in a way that they just aren't maintaining themselves.
Fascinating. So we talked now about more or less two or the three main dangers. We also talked about how the astronauts can, work against it, especially with the physical activity. I would also like to go into the topic of medication and drugs, right? I think one of your main jobs is to design drugs so they work according to the environment of space. Now, a silly question. Let's say I'm an astronaut and I have a headache in space. Can I take an aspirin?
Absolutely.
Works the same.
I don't know, but you can take it.
Okay.
And many astronauts have. There are also other ordinary pain relievers available on the ISS, ibuprofen, Tylenol. Yeah.
Okay.
So the medications that are available on the ISS are the same things that we would use down here. There are no special formulations. No. NASA does not have the means to develop new drugs and test new drugs. So they are faced with using what's available and approved now. My job at NASA was to think about whether astronaut needs were going to be met by what was in the kit, and to kind of keep an eye out for any red flags about whether something was not working or whether something seemed to have unusual side effects, that kind of thing.
So the astronauts basically took what we have here on Earth just up into space. They used it, and the idea was, okay, well, if it works, perfect. If there is something different, we need to think about the solutions.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So
Yes,
there is no
exactly.
special space medicine that you have to take with you because it works completely different.
No, so we don't.
I saw way too many sci-fi movies, so perhaps that's why.
So that's something that we might fantasize about. It'd be nice to have an anti-radiation pill. We don't have that yet. Although with radiation therapy being so common for cancer patients, there are many drug companies on Earth who are developing things like that. And I have been keeping an eye on those developments in hopes that maybe what they develop is something that could be useful for astronauts in the future. But the reality is that drug development and testing is incredibly expensive. It's on the order of $1 billion per drug.
So unless you're a big pharma company with an R&D, you are probably not gonna, pull this off.
Right, and asking any space agency to absorb that cost is unreasonable. Yeah.
Another thing which I wanted to ask you is, so also one of your jobs was to design the medical kits that the astronauts are taking with them into space in a way that it lasts. So you had to pay attention to the factor of time, but also the spatial factor, because as we already said, these stations are not large, right? They are very small in space. So how did you deal with that?
So first off, I don't design the medical kit. However, I may have been asked to advise the pharmacists and physicians who were designing the kit. So caveat aside, thinking about what you would most need, there are some analog situations you can look at to determine what needs might be on a mission. You know how many people are going to be on board. You know how long they're going to be there. You can look at information like, previous spaceflight missions for, how many times was an aspirin needed, kind of thing. Those are in the records. You can also look at what were the needs of remote Antarctic missions. What were they needing? What about crews on submarines? They might have some similar needs. So NASA has pulled together data from what they call spaceflight analogs like this into a big model, a computer model they call the integrated medical model, where they look at what was the rate of occurrence per person of various medical conditions and what were the treatments applied and what were those treatments. So we actually have numbers that we can put on things. A certain 0.05 events of some medical event per person per year. And using that, you can extrapolate what your needs might be for a mission of whatever length of time with whatever number of crew. So based on real practical experience with previous space flights and modeling like that, we can make a good guess. Then, now with the ISS, these folks are not very far away. And we have 4 to 6 missions that go to the ISS every year. So we can monitor what they're using, keep track of what gets used up, what looks like it's getting low. They can report back to Earth, and we can send up more. And that information goes into future planning as well. What needed to be restocked under what conditions.
So the planning is getting basically better and better with the amount of data that you have through the missions that have been already done, and thanks to a clever use of the analog data that you have from submarines and some other remote missions, where basically the idea is the same. People go there, and there is no line of supply, which is always there, so people cannot just go, to a shop outside and get the stuff.
That's right. It's a long way to the nearest drugstore, the nearest pharmacy. Yeah. And with the ISS, we really don't have to think about medication stability over time because we have such frequent resupply missions. The pharmacists who are dispensing these medications on Earth are keeping track of the expiration date on everything they send up, and they will notify the crew members when something is nearing expiration. The crew members will pull that from active use, it gets replaced, and what they pull out of active use usually gets destroyed. They pack it with the trash onto one of the vehicles that burns up after it docks with the ISS. So essentially incinerating them in space.
Why is it not advisable to use any kind of medication or drug beyond the expiration date?
So it's a great question. And we've all faced it, right? We've all used expired medications, whether we intended to or not. We have. I've actually been horrified at finding expired medications around my own house, how old some of them have been. It happens, but it's not advisable. And there are a couple of reasons why. Medicines do degrade over time. We know this. This is an absolute fact. They do degrade over time. And it's not just the active ingredient, it's also the inactive ingredients that degrade. And things like temperature, humidity, exposure to light, exposure to oxygen, they all drive degradation for various chemical components in a medication form. So in In any medication dosage form, you've got not only an active ingredient, but some inactive or inert ingredients. So it's a chemical mixture. It's a complex chemical mixture. There's complicated chemistry going on inside one little tablet, and that can be influenced by humidity, temperature, light, oxygen. Changes going on over time, continuously. We can try and limit it with good packaging, but you can't stop it. Now, two things can happen. The active ingredient can degrade, and it can degrade into a form where it's less active or inactive. So your unit dose has less active ingredient. So it's like taking a lower dose. So that's one situation where the dose is getting lower and lower over time. Another situation that we know of with a few medications, ingredients degrade, and it could be active or inert ingredients. Ingredients degrade to form something that is toxic to us. So rather than having an active ingredient get lower and lower in concentration over time, you may have something potentially dangerous getting higher and higher in concentration over time. Now, it's unfortunate that around the world, none of our regulatory bodies seem to be tracking which medications fall into which of those categories. So as a consumer, and frankly, physicians and pharmacists don't know this information either. We don't know which drug falls into which category. So that being the case, the only safe way to use our medications is to use them within the expiration date.
So that's the only way how to be safe. Could you give me an example of a medication that when it expires, it becomes toxic, and then if somebody actually really, takes it, what the consequences could be?
We learned about this in the 1960s with tetracycline antibiotics. Individuals, and the most dramatic publication that's out there is a case report from a child who's given an antibiotic that had been stored in the home for some time and was expired, but no one thought anything of it. The child became quite ill and was taken to the emergency room and had to be treated for kidney failure. And it was traced back. They did some tox studies and determined that there was this poison in the bloodstream, and that chemically could be traced back to a degradation product from the tetracycline. So that was our first heads up that some medications do actually become dangerous.
Well, kidney failure is nothing to joke with,
No.
Leading to death. So, okay, no more pills which are, beyond the expiration date. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I urge everyone to go clean out their medicine kits, their cabinets. Yeah, do that on maybe a yearly basis. Make it part of spring cleaning to get rid of those old medications. Even things that you buy over the counter, like aspirin and Tylenol, degrade and can suffer in performance or cause increases in compounds that are probably not good for you. The FDA standards for acetaminophen, Tylenol, in this country have recently been changed by the FDA, requiring a higher purity because of recognition that one of the degradation products is slightly toxic. So that's one to get rid of, absolutely. And with your ordinary aspirin bottle, you can perform a test yourself. If you open a bottle of old aspirin and sniff, you sometimes smell vinegar. That is a breakdown product.
Thank you very much for the little how do you call it? Life hacks. You call it life hacks. I wish I
had a test like that for every medicine.
That would be great. That would be great. You drop the pill into a glass, it becomes blue. You know it's bad. You shouldn't eat it.
Yeah, don't use that.
I think one of the things that you did, or you and your colleagues did together, is that you learn from certain other animals, or let's say living organisms, how to deal with the radiation in space. This was something very interesting for me, that researchers look into the animal kingdom to find possible ideas how to deal with radiation exposure.
So I haven't done this work myself, but I have, working in a grant-providing institution, funded a few people who do. We thought this was just an absolutely fascinating way to go. There are some organisms that are relatively resistant to environmental stressors like radiation or not many animals on Earth find themselves being exposed to radiation. So they probably get naturally exposed to things like dehydration or a high salt content in their water or changes in temperature, things like that. And it seems that some of these organisms that are very resistant to those natural environmental stressors are naturally resistant to radiation as well. So what's different about those animals? What makes them resistant? Could we learn something from that we could then use to our own advantage, whether it be pharmacologically or otherwise? So we sponsored research looking at E. coli and tardigrades, and there were a lot of jokes. You've heard a joke about how a cockroach will be the only animal to survive a nuclear war.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So we didn't fund any cockroach work. I haven't run across any researchers working on radiation exposure in cockroaches. I don't know if that's really real or just a joke. But to all the radiation researchers out there working on cockroaches, you may have some spaceflight applications here. Get in touch with NASA.
I also saw that you wrote a book called Space Pharmacology. Is that right?
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
Could you give us, a few highlights of what you wrote in this book? Maybe some, like the top-notch highlight from your research that would interest our audience.
So this work came out of my first year working at Johnson Space Center. As I told you, I had no background in space. So I had to educate myself with the literature regarding what had been done with respect to pharmacology research in spaceflight. So that's what this book is. It was me educating myself. So I looked at pharmacokinetics affected by spaceflight, and also a number of aspects of pharmacodynamics. In pharmacokinetics, there were a couple things that did jump out. One is we have never done anything more than a very low-end experiment in the world of PK. There have been a few individuals who have taken medications in flight and had blood sampled, or in some cases, saliva sampled. Those samples returned to Earth later, concentrations measured over time, just as you would on Earth. Because the number of subjects has been so small, we can't draw a conclusion. The results are very variable. And as you probably are aware, most pharmacology studies like this, because human variability is so broad, we need at least dozens of people. Pharmaceutical companies typically test hundreds for these kinds of studies. Yeah. So we just have little data points right now, and there's a need for more information. But one thing that did come out conclusively in the first few days of any spaceflight and the first few days of returning to Earth and experiencing 1G gravity again, many astronauts experience GI symptoms. They may feel nauseous, they may vomit. That affects your GI motility. So if you're talking about using an oral dosage form of a drug, obvious issue there. Yeah, big possibility for changes if GI motility is being changed.
Did you also have to work with MDs, doctors, which were part of the team? Can you tell us a little bit about that? How did it go? What did they bring to the table from their expertise? Or was there somebody, I don't know, we would not expect to be on the team like that, working together with you guys? I don't know, some sort of technician that we don't even know that really exists. A crazy profession that is unknown to the public.
Well, I don't know about crazy professions, but there are operational medical teams. There are flight surgeons and pharmacists, and there might be a unique flight person involved, the biomedical engineer. So in mission control, there's a seat for a flight surgeon. There's also a seat for the biomedical engineer. They sit side by side, and they have a lot of communication with each other and also with their crew members in flight. So what they're hearing about crew member needs during a flight, crew member experiences, they deal with. And then if they feel like operations in the future need to change, they may call for some meetings with the pharmacy folks, with the folks like me over in research. And in the research group at Johnson Space Center, there's pharmacology. There's also a little laboratory studying bone, a little laboratory studying muscle, a neurovestibular laboratory, a cardiovascular laboratory, a nutritional sciences lab, an immune system lab. There's, every department is represented there. And on many questions that come up, many operational events may include people from all of these groups.
Okay.
Since our physiology is not bottlenecked into particular physiological systems. We tend to experience things as an entire organism.
So you need basically, let's call them an expert for each of the field, come together and kind of sort out if something needs to be adjusted. Okay.
Exactly.
Now, you spend a lot of time, back in the day with astronaut. Do you perhaps, as a close-up for our talk, have a interesting anecdote that you heard from an astronaut? Maybe somehow related to, medicine, your work.
So an astronaut physician, Mike Barrett, came to me one day and asked, on the topic of medication stability, I'd been wrestling with that and he knew about it. Why can't you just make the drugs up there? And, so I thought about it. Your initial response is, that's funny. Hard to replicate a pharmaceutical manufacturing plant in space. How would you do that? But drug manufacturers themselves take the active ingredient in isolation, and that can be stored in a minus 80 freezer indefinitely. If you can make it that cold and it's in isolation from the other ingredients, it is very stable. You can't do that with a single pill, because the pill is mixed with all of the other ingredients, and you actually increase degradation of medications that are meant for room temperature storage and put them in the freezer. That's no good. But the isolated active ingredients, you could do that. So if we took up a list of active ingredients and a few generalized inert ingredients that we could make a dosage form with, could we build our own pills? Well, and Mike was walking through the logic of this for me. What I would do in the laboratory is take some of the powdered ingredient to my balance and weigh it out. Like, oops, that's not going to work in microgravity. That just can't be done. All right, an alternative would be to take some of the powder and mix it with liquid and measure with a pipetter. All right, this is closer to being reasonable. But as soon as you mix a medication into a liquid form, you've now actually shortened its stability because you've mixed in water, which is an awful lot of humidity. So you could do that for a dose you're going to take immediately, but not for one you want to keep on the shelf available for weeks or months. So we're partway there. So we kind of got stuck. We got stuck. It was a fun idea to talk through, and this was a few years ago. But then the first 3D printed pill got approved by the FDA in the States. And that made me realize, okay, maybe we are getting closer now. Maybe there would be a way to use the mechanical devices in a 3D printer to do that measuring for you and construct dosage forms almost as needed. So that's another avenue where there is active research at this time. Yeah. And that came out of what seemed like a silly question coming from a really smart astronaut.
Thank you very much for taking your time. This was a very pleasant and super informative talk.
Oh, Michael, I had fun speaking with you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
This was The Voice of Medicine. Make sure you tune in next time and take care.